little bit about the book. When I chose this book, I looked at several different books on Romans. We'll back up a little bit. Why Romans? One of the things that I want to try to do before I get too old and can't think about what I'm doing, which is coming up pretty quick, is to look and try to understand the more difficult books in the Bible that I've had trouble with over the years. Romans is one of those books. In fact, when I talked to Michael last week, and I told him I was teaching Romans, he kind of laughed and he said, the meat of the word. And that's basically what it is. When you look at Romans, Romans is a very simple book as far as its concept, which is the law of Moses was not able to save man. The gospel saves man. That both the Jews and the Gentiles were in need of salvation because they both stood condemned. And then how to coexist with each other in the gospel of Christ, because the gospel of Christ is able to save us, to sanctify us, to justify us, and to give us the hope of salvation. So it's a very simple concept, but Paul deals with some very hard to understand subjects. And so when I looked at that, it was the idea that we have to look at the book from the standpoint of how the Jews and the Gentiles in their time received the letter. Now, he talks a lot, and in fact, the title of the book says Salvation by a System of Faith. We're not going to be talking a whole lot about salvation by faith today and how the congregations, how denominationalism today deals with it, but rather we'll be looking at how the Jews and the Gentiles in the day of Paul received this and how it applied to their particular situation. Now, with that said, I think we should get a good understanding of what Paul was teaching about salvation through the system of faith. And with the knowledge that we've learned over the past few years, and Mark does a tremendous amount of teaching on faith and faith only and those kinds of subjects that are taught by religious denominations, that we don't really need to try to make that application again. I don't think our time would be well spent there, because I think we can make that application as we understand what Paul was saying in Romans. Now, we will talk about it some, but we're not going to dwell a whole lot on it, because I think we need to look at the arguments that Paul makes and try to understand them. Now, if you're like me and you read the book of Romans, after you get about 3 or 4 chapters, man, your mind is boggled. At least mine is. Because Paul makes some very interesting and unique ways of making arguments. And by the time you get to the end of the book, there's some spotches in there that you can understand, but then there's some that just, I'll be honest with you now, I spent about 2 weeks trying to figure out Romans chapter 7, and I think it's verses 13 through the end of the chapter. And I'm still not really clear on what Paul is saying there. And we'll hopefully get that straightened out by the time we get there. But anyway, the book. It's a very thick book. I kind of decided to go with this book for one particular reason. Is that all the other workbooks were kind of, they were kind of thin. They had questions and some comments, maybe a short outline of the book. This one provides commentary. Now, Park Ryder does go into some of the details of salvation by faith only that you read about today, which kind of discourages me a little bit, because I was looking for something that was more in tune with just what the book of Romans was talking about. But nonetheless, it's a good book. And one thing I will say about it, because of its thickness, it will not lay flat. And you'll look at it and you say, this thing it's hardly easy to use. I'll tell you something, it's got a staple right here in the middle. If you take your back cover and open it up, and open that staple up, then go to the front cover, the pocket knife kind of pry that thing up and get some needle nose pliers on it and yank that staple out, this thing will lay flat. It's got a pretty good glue binding, and if the pages do start coming out, just throw you some Elmer's glue in there and they'll stay put. So, another thing, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Anyway, salvation by a system of faith. this is the book that we've got. There is an ebook for those that like electronic readers that's available from basicbiblestudies.net. It's, I don't know, it's $5 or $6. If you'd like to have a ebook copy, let me know and we'll get one provided for you. What I did is I picked one up, I converted the EPUB into a PDF, and it worked great. Romans, a System, Salvation by System of Faith by Robert Cartwright. Now, one thing, if you haven't noticed it, you will notice it if you look at both of these books. But this particular book, Commentary on Paul's Letter to the Saints at Rome by Robert Whiteside, this is a gem. Now, I provided the PDF for it in our newsletter that I send out every Saturday. If you haven't downloaded it, do so. It's an excellent book. Now, if you don't like PDFs, you can get this thing off Amazon, and it's a paperback, and it's probably about $14, $15. But it's an excellent read. Now, what I found out is that Harkwriter lifts a lot of material from this book and puts it into his workbook. Now, to me, that was a plus because Harkwriter is a good writer. This is a great book. And Harkwriter, I'm not going to say plagiarism, but I found some quotes that he made, but he didn't make application to where he got it from. But anyway, I think it's good that he did do that. Now, the second book that we had is this one. It's also a PDF that we had in the weekly reader. Now, the book by David Pratt is excellent because of one particular reason. And this reason is it's identified as a commentary to the letter of Romans. It says Bible study notes and comments. But he makes comments, but he throws at you a tremendous amount of reference material as far as verses to do this, and verses that go with this, and verses that go with that. This guy's good. Never heard of him before, but he's a gospel preacher up in Ohio. He started back in the 70s preaching, so I guess now he's probably about 70 years old or better. But if you haven't downloaded that one, or if you'd like to purchase it, you can get it off Amazon. It's also about $15, $16. And if you'd like to have a hard copy, can't afford it, let me know and we'll get it for you. Two good books to go along with our study. Now, this is where I'm going to run out of time. The book of Romans, if you've read it, like I asked you to, deals with the salvation of the Gentiles and the salvation of the Jews. And you will notice within the first 3 chapters of the book, Paul very explicitly comes out and says that all men have sinned, both Gentiles and both Jews, and he goes out to start showing how both have sinned before God. Now, we accept that as fact. And over the years, I've kind of wondered, how could God judge the Gentiles? And one of the things that I found out is that Romans 4, chapter 4, verse 15, comes out and says, without a law, there is no sin. Where there is no law, there is no sin. So if the Gentiles did not have a law, how could they violate God's law? You see the dilemma there? So evidently there was a law in place for them to violate, to commit sin, that Paul was dealing with in the first 3 chapters of the book of Romans. The second thing that we look at, he says, who in times past allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Now this kind of gives us another dilemma. If there was a law that they committed sin against, why did he allow them to walk in their own ways? Well, to me that kind of indicates that there was something in place. He didn't give them specific instructions that they were allowed to walk in their own ways, but there was something that he held them accountable for. And when we look in Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 5, Isaiah says, the earth is also defiled by its inhabitants, because they have transgressed the laws, violated the ordinances, and broken the everlasting covenant. Now, there has to have been a law. He allowed them to walk in their own ways. What were these laws, these ordinances, and the everlasting covenant that the entire inhabitants of the world violated? Because Paul says in this particular book that man everywhere sinned, and it was necessary for the gospel and the death of Christ to provide the means of forgiveness of that sins. So over the years, and when I say years, I'm talking 30, 35 years, this has been something that kind of bothered me and kind of made me wonder. And so one day, one long time, took me, I read through the Old Testament, and I tried to mentally keep my mind attuned to the fact that, oh, here's a nation committed a sin, God condemned it. And I made note of it. And that's what you'll find in your handouts. Your handouts list what I found. Now, they may be jumbled up because when I printed this out, I did not go back and fine tune all of this, but this is just my immediate concept of read a verse, my quick application, who it was applied to, and it went on. Now, there may be some misapplication there, so be aware of that. But I wanted you to have this because hopefully sometime down the road, you younger guys will take it and finish up what I've started, because I doubt if I will. So what were the laws of the Bible that we read about concerning mankind? Now I know this is kind of difficult to see on the screen, but it's probably, I think, the second page in your handout, but I think it's very important for us to look at it. If you were to look from eternity, the beginning of the world, to the end of the world, we see that God spoke greatly to the patriarchs. And when we say patriarchs, he gave a law to Adam. He said, do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or you'll die. Well, that was a law. Adam violated that law. And we see laws given to the patriarchs through the years. And even though the patriarchs that were following God received these laws, the other nations were aware of certain laws of morality. You remember when Abraham went into Egypt, told Pharaoh, this is my sister, didn't mention anything about his wife. When Pharaoh found out about it, he was extremely upset. He said, why do you want to condemn me for taking another man's wife? So there's a law of morality there. But anyway, this law of the patriarchs went to the time of Mount Sinai, at which time God, according to the promise to Abraham, separated the 12 tribes of Israel and gave them a law which we refer to as the law of Moses. The rest of the world were separated from that law. And really it couldn't be called the law of the patriarchs anymore, because the patriarchs were the fathers that, in my opinion, were the fathers that were following God. So these people began to have what we call the law of the Gentiles, which is not a biblical term by any respect. The law of Moses gave specific ordinances as far as sacrifices, feast days, this and that, and it also had laws of morality, what you had to do with each other, and concerning your relationship to God. Unique thing about the law of Moses, in that it was different from the gospel of Christ, is that we are to go out and to teach the whole world and to convert as many people as we can. From what I understand from my reading of the law of Moses, this was never a requirement of the Jews. They were not required to go out into the world and teach people the law of Moses. But the law of Moses, and I think the reason behind that was that you need to keep yourself separated from the world, because we are bringing the Christ through your lineage. But the law of Moses allowed for people that were Gentiles to become proselytes. If a proselyte said, I want to be a follower of the law of Moses, and I'll adhere to all of its precepts and all of its commands, then God made allowance for that. But in the Jewish mind, we have Gentiles that want to follow the law of Moses, but yet they're just maybe a little bit higher than the rest of the world, because now they're trying to adhere, but there's that middle wall of partition that really kept them separated. So the law of Moses made allowance, but it was not a requirement. Now, the law of Moses, as we know, came to an end with the death of Christ. From Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14, it says that the law was nailed to the cross. And at that point, the law of Moses came to an end. 50 days later, in Acts chapter 2, we see that the gospel was preached for the first time for the remission of sins to the Jews. Now, there was a 50-day period there. We have to ask ourselves, if the law of Moses came to an end at the day on the cross, 50 days later, the gospel to the Jews began. What happened? What kind of law were they under within that 50-day period? Well, I kind of tend to think they fell back into the law of the patriarchs, the law of the Jews, the Gentiles, and the law of the morality. Then about, I want to say it was 10 years later, Cornelius was the first Gentile convert into the law, into the church. And at that time, the law of the Gentiles came to an end. Now, there was 50 years there that the gospel was in force. Does that mean that the Gentiles were not part of that, did they not have a law? No, I kind of think that the law of Gentiles continued for the Gentiles themselves until the conversion of Cornelius. And then we see in Acts chapter 17 and verse 30, Paul makes a statement that God has now commanded all men everywhere to repent. In other words, there was no law of Moses, no law of the Gentiles, it is now the law of Christ. And I think that began on Acts chapter 10. So, this was a concept that I kind of put together from what I saw in the Bible in relation to all of this. Everybody up with me? We're going to run out of time. My introduction to the law and to Romans is probably going to take us 2, maybe 3 classes, so don't miss out. So concerning the law of Gentiles, what were the transgressions that condemned the Gentiles? You know, if we were to look at a law that did not give us specific commands, but we see that God gave specific results under certain situations, we should be able to see that situation is a result of a command. In other words, if, like Nebuchadnezzar, if pride condemned him or condemned the nations, wouldn't it be that God was looking for humility among the world? That when people elevated themselves, he condemned them? So we can take the sin itself, look at its opposite, and we say, this is what God intended for the world to be like. And that's what we have in this list of that I handed out to you. Now, the nations and the cities and the people condemned by God were numerous. We had Ammon, Amorites, Ethiopia, the Cherethites, Damascus, the Edomites, the Egyptians, Greece, Media and Persia, Moab, Nineveh, Philistines, Samaria, Seir, Sidon, Tyre, Judah, Israel, and Ephraim. And Ephraim, we know, is one of the 2 sons of Joseph. So God, as we'll see in some of these sins that God condemned him for, a lot of nations were involved in this condemnation. So let's go through our list a little bit. I didn't put this in here by nation. I kind of just grabbed it and threw it in there. There's going to be some repeats. So as we go through it, just kind of mentally think what the Gentile nations were condemned of. Arrogant hate in Ezekiel. They killed women with child in Amos. There was a mockery of God's judgment in Ezekiel. Pride, Zephaniah. Pride in their strength, Jeremiah. Pride in their heart, Obadiah. Made war with his brother, Amos. Probably, if I remember right, I think that was Edomites maybe warring with Israel. Boasting. Idolatry. They strove against God. There's arrogant pride. Arrogance that they placed themselves above God. It was an arrogance that was so high that they thought they were better than God. Unrighteous vengeance. It was a desire to steal. Edom made war with his brother. Edom was proud of Israel's destruction. Violence to their brother Jacob. Edom robbed Judah. Perpetual hatred. They shed innocent blood. They stole from God. Unrighteousness. Self-exaltation. Enslavement of the people for Edom. Self-magnification. Desecration of the dead king. Great wickedness. Lies and raping. Evil and violence. Exalted evil men. Sold Israelites for drunkenness and fornication. Unrighteous vengeance. Idolatry, including child sacrifice to their false gods. And in lewdness. Murder, and oppression of the poor and needy. They committed falsehood and robbery, mockery, and arrogance. These were the things that I found in the Bible about the nations of Gentiles. There are probably a lot more I just didn't pick up on. That God condemned the Gentiles for this. Now, if we were to take the opposite of these things, we knew what they should have been doing. But they stood condemned for these items. Now, kind of keep this in the back of your mind as we go through our list. The Gentiles were under a law, and that law emphasized morality, and it had set standards that God expected them to live by. This was a law that began with the patriarchs before the Mosaic law until the conversion of Cornelius. And the letter to the Romans emphasizes this law. I think we see this when God condemns the world, that some of these items that I think Paul mentions in chapter 2, we find in this list. But it emphasizes this law that the Romans, that said the Gentiles were guilty of. So the Gentiles were found guilty, but Paul says in Romans that the gospel provided freedom from their sins, freedom from enslavement. It gave them righteousness, sanctification, and I should have put in justification, but I didn't. Left it off accidentally, and then salvation. So the Gentiles were in a condition that was against God. God could not accept. The gospel brings them into a situation in which they can be found righteous before God. Now, Israel and Judah, they were two split nations. Israel, 10 tribes went north. Judah had 2 tribes that stayed south. Let's take a look at what condemned the 10 tribes of the northern nation of Israel. They afflicted needy, perverted justice, arrogance, blasphemy. They corrupted the righteous. They defiled God's name. They had a desire to sin, disregarding God, disrespectful of God, ease of living in pleasure, false divination of soothsayers, gross fornication. They hated the righteous. They were haughty. They were involved in idolatry. In fact, I had this, I don't know why I left all those up there, but they were deemed pretty bad for idolatry. In fact, I think if there was anything that God hated more than anything else in all of these sins that were committed, idolatry was probably number 1, and pride was number 2. But I don't know if that's the way God thinks. Don't say that's the way God thinks. Lack of knowledge. Lazy pleasure seekers. Long list of items. Lying. Strengthening the wicked. There was a wicked person there, you elevated him and made him stronger than he was. Lying prophets. Multiple sins listed. And I should have went back and looked at that, but Jeremiah chapter 7 just lists a whole bunch of stuff. Murder and idolatry. Murder of children. Murder of the just. No respect for priests or elders. Perversion of justice. Pride in their strength. And I've said this before. When the Soviet Union fell back in 1990-91, President Clinton got up on national TV in response to that and said, "We are now the most powerful nation in the world." And when I saw that, I like to hit the floor, because I got to thinking about pride and strength. That's not good for the leader of our nation to say that we're the most powerful nation in the world. They profane God. They refuse to listen to God. rejected God's ordinances, pride and prosperous ease, profaned God's name, rebellion towards God, religious hypocrisy, the rejection of statutes, and the rejection of ordinances. They sold the righteous and the needy, soothsayers, trampled the poor, transgression and sacrifices, uncleanness and transgression, various abominations in Ezekiel chapter 33. They violated the law of pledges, violence. Their wealth was a stumbling block to them. They loved other gods, multiple sins in Hosea chapter 4. They married foreigners, which was forbidden, and they bore children to their nation, which God forbid them to do. They walked after man's commands. They transgressed God's covenant. They had iniquity and bloodshed was on them. Priests committed murder and lewdness, whoredoms, wickedness and lies. They rebelled against God. Idolatry and unapproved kings lied against God, and they expanded their false religion, and they had forgotten their God. Do you see, if you were to take out just the things that were a sin against the Israelites against God, and just look at the things that were a sin against the Israelites against their fellow man, tend to start seeing a common thing here between the Gentiles. You know, it's kind of pretty much the same. Let's take a look at the southern nation of Judah. They were violent servants. There was violence in them. Violence and lies. They rejected the law of God. Arrogance. They were even considered to be worse than the Amorites. Let me tell you something. I don't think there was anything worse than the Amorites in this world, from what I can read in the Bible. They caused the women to be homeless, and they took the children's glory away from them. Micah chapter 2 and verse 9. It was child sacrifice. Covetous and oppression of brothers' possessions. They despised holy things. They destroyed their own people. They devise and they practice iniquity, and they diligently do evil. There was a disbelief in God's judgment, dishonorable children, dishonorable prophets. They disrespected God's law. They practiced divination. They elevated the wicked. They enslaved their brothers. There was filthiness and lewdness, forsaking God. They hated God and they loved evil. They were haughty. There was idol worship, idolatry, more idolatry, leaders in dishonest gain. There was lewdness, multiple types of sinners, murder and idolatry, murder and lewdness, oppression of people, perverted justice, power and pride. They robbed the poor and they oppressed them. The prophets were thieves. They're proud of their sins. They robbed the poor. Robbery. They sold God's instructions. Sexual immorality. They were shameless. They were involved in theft. They used the temple to rob people. You remember when Jesus threw out the money changers in the temple? The people were there selling sacrifices and things needed to go into the temple and worship God with. They were using the temple even back then to rob people. And you know, this morning I was sitting there looking at that and I was thinking, you know, I've been in some religious denomination buildings for one purpose or another, weddings and what have you. Some of these places have got coffee shops set up. You know, come over here, throw $1 in the bucket, and get you a cup of coffee. So that made me think: are these people robbers in God's temple to rob people? So what do we see? We can conclude that the Jews were guilty of violating the law of Moses, violating the law of Moses. They stood condemned. But yet, the gospel provided the Jews, as we'll see in this book of Romans, that they are provided with freedom, righteousness, sanctification, justification, and salvation. So, when I look at all of this, I can see where the world was in such a situation that when Christ did come, his death was of such importance that every person in this world benefited from it. And to say that anyone stood righteous before God is not understanding about their relationship with God. Paul points this out very pointedly in the book of Romans. And as we'll see as we go through our introduction, Paul was in a very precarious, not precarious, but a particular situation. He stood in the middle of a group of people that were Gentiles that had nothing to do, didn't have a care in the world about their salvation. And he had Gentiles that were concerned about their salvation, but they were having problems with the Jews, saying that, as we saw in Acts chapter, we'll see in Acts chapter 15, had to be circumcised, had to obey the law of Moses. What are we supposed to do, Paul? You know, these Jews over here that have the law of Moses telling us one thing, you're telling us something. What? So he had non-believing Gentiles, we had Gentiles that were confused, and I'm sure there was Gentiles that were firmly seated in the gospel of Christ that understood these things. Then on the other side, he had the Jews that were probably out to kill Paul because they felt like he was trying to destroy Judaism and the law of Moses and everything associated with their history and their being as a people, and the promises given to Abraham that they'd be a great nation, and Paul sitting here trying to destroy all that, so he was having to deal with them on one side. Then he had those Jews that were converted but still trying to hold on to the old tenets of the law of Moses, and then he had the Jews probably that were totally convinced, totally converted, didn't have a problem. So put Paul in the middle, with this group of people around him, and you have the book of Romans. Paul was trying to bring unity to these people by trying to explain to all of these people why the gospel of Christ is superior to the law of Moses, and why, as a planet of humanity, Christ is your Savior. He had his hands full. Now, we tend to worry at times about, you know, what am I going to say to my neighbor, or what am I going to say? Paul was dealing with massive groups of people. And one thing I will say, that as we get into Romans and you start seeing the complexity of some of his arguments, he wrote this to the church in Rome. I got to thinking, why wouldn't he have written something like this to the church in Corinth? Because Corinth really wasn't in a mental situation, or at least had the mentality at that time to accept, to understand what Paul was saying. He sent this to the church at Rome, which kind of tells me about the mentality of the Romans. They were probably very strong in faith, they understood things, and they were not a church that required the milk of the word. They could understand and take heed of the meat. Now, we'll go through the rest of our introduction, and maybe finish it Wednesday, and may finish it Sunday, and then we'll start the book itself. Anyway, I appreciate y'all's attention.